The clay cup shattered against the stone floor of the great hall like a thunderclap, and every lord, merchant, and border captain in Ironwall's castle went silent. Dura Wildheart stood at the center of the betrothal dais with the broken shards at her feet, her chest heaving, her green-gold eyes blazing with a fury that could have singed the tapestries off the walls. She was magnificent in her anger, tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a warrior's posture that no amount of silk treaty dressing could disguise. She wore fitted battle leathers dyed a deep forest green, the bodice laced tight across her strong frame, her dark braid coiled over one shoulder and tied with a cord of iron beads that clinked softly when she moved. The leather was tooled with her clan's wolf and thorn pattern along the edges, and beneath it she wore a close-fitted linen blouse the color of cream. Every eye in the room tracked her like she was a fire that had just jumped its pit. "I will not drink from a cup poured by a man who calls my people animals in the same breath he calls them allies," she said, and her voice was low and iron-steady, which somehow made it more frightening than a shout. She swept her gaze around the assembled men, Lord Harwick on his carved chair, his advisors in their velvet, the border captains with their polished swords, and all the watching merchants from the lower town, and not one of them moved to speak. "I said I would pour my own. Let anyone here call that defiance who dares." The silence lasted exactly as long as it took for a cup to be raised from the back of the room. Daniel Garrison had not intended to be holding his cup when the orc woman shattered hers. He had been standing near the rear of the great hall because that was where a fletcher from the lower market belonged, near the servants, near the doors, near the exit if things went badly, which things were now very clearly doing. He had come to this betrothal ceremony only because Lord Harwick had commanded every guild master and skilled craftsman within the walls of Ironwall to attend, to show the Grimtusk clan delegation that the town's population stood united behind the treaty. Daniel made the finest arrows on the border. His attendance had been compulsory. He had not expected to admire her. He had not expected, when every other man in the room flinched or looked at the floor, to find his own arm lifting with his half-full cup of rough red wine. "I will hold mine out," he said. The words surprised him as much as they surprised anyone else. His voice was not commanding. It was just steady, the way his hands were steady when he knocked an arrow. If you are pouring your own, you might as well pour for someone who asked for it. The whole room looked at him. Lord Harwick looked at him. The clan chieftain Grimtusk, a mountain of gray-green muscle sitting to Harwick's right, looked at him, and Dura Wildheart looked at him. Her eyes found his across the long expanse of the hall, and something moved in them that he could not name: surprise, maybe, or the careful recalculation a fighter makes when the terrain shifts beneath their feet. "You are not one of these lords," she said. It was not an insult. "No," he agreed. "I am a fletcher. I make arrows. I am here because Harwick told me I had to be." One corner of her mouth shifted. It was barely a movement. It might have been a smile, or it might have been her deciding whether to throw something at him. "A fletcher," she repeated. "The best on the border, I am told," said Daniel. He was aware that he had just said the most arrogant sentence of his adult life and felt oddly calm about it. "Though I admit the competition is not fierce." She walked toward him. The crowd parted for her the way water parts for a stone dropped into a pool, not slowly, not gently, but with a kind of inevitability. She walked until she was 2 feet from him, and up close she was even more striking, green-gold eyes bright with intelligence, a small scar bisecting her lower lip on the left side, her tusks short, graceful curves of ivory framing a mouth that was set in an expression of absolute assessment. She was measuring him. He let her. She took the clay pitcher from the table beside her, the one that had been set out for the betrothal ceremony, and she poured. The wine hit his cup with a clean, decisive sound. "Then you understand," she said quietly, "that the arrow matters as much as the bow." "More," he said. "The bow is just a lever. The arrow is the promise." She held his gaze for a heartbeat, and the silence in the room was enormous, and then she poured herself a cup from the same pitcher and drank it standing across from him with her eyes still on his face. The betrothal ceremony, technically speaking, was over. The treaty, technically speaking, was in ruins. Daniel Garrison drank his wine and tried to think of what in the world he had just done. What he had done, he learned the next morning, was accidentally become the most discussed man in Ironwall. His workshop sat in the lower market district, a narrow two-story building wedged between a cooper's yard and a tanner's stall, with the smell of sawdust and fletching glue permanently embedded in its walls. He had inherited it from his master, Aldous Carpenter, who had taught him everything about the craft and then died of a fever 3 winters ago, leaving Daniel the shop, the tools, 2 broken lathes, and a crippling loneliness that he had learned to fill with work. He was 28. He lived alone above the shop with a cat named Bolt who was indifferent to him in the way that only cats and certain merchants could manage. He was at his workbench before the sun was fully up, sorting goose feathers for fletchings, when he heard the knock. Dura Wildheart did not look like someone who knocked. She looked like someone who kicked doors off their hinges and asked questions later. But she knocked, and when he opened the door she was standing in the morning light with her braids still neat and her iron bead cord catching the early sun, and she said, without preamble, "I need to speak with you about a proposition." "Come in," he said, because what else was there to say? She looked around his workshop with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential weapons or exits the long racks of finished arrows, the bundled shafts of different woods sorted by grain and weight, the jars of glue and lacquer, the fox and goose feathers spread out on clean cloth, the tools hanging in their ordered rows. She picked up one of his finished arrows, holding it between 2 fingers and rolling it with a practiced touch. "Straight," she said. "I do not make crooked ones. These fletching angles are unusual." She turned the arrow so the light caught the slight spiral set of the feathers. "More spin, more accuracy at range. Less forgiveness at close quarters," he said. "But on the border most fights happen at range. I make what the border needs." He folded his arms, watching her. "What proposition?" She set the arrow back precisely where she had taken it from. That small, careful act of returning a thing to its place told him something about her that he filed away without quite knowing why. "The betrothal is broken," she said. "You were there. You saw what I did and why I did it. Lord Harwick called your people animals." He said it to his advisor while the ceremony wine was being poured. "I was standing close enough to hear it." Her eyes sharpened. "You heard." "I have good ears. Fletchers develop them." He paused. He also said that the marriage was only meant to last long enough to get the Grimtusk warband off his eastern border. He had no intention of honoring the trade agreements. The silence between them stretched taut as a bowstring. "Then you understand," she said, "why the cup had to break." "I understand. So does half the castle by now." He leaned against his workbench. "What I do not understand is why you are at my door at sunrise." "Because," she said, and this time the word had weight to it, like she was placing something fragile and precise in his hands. "The treaty is broken, and Grimtusk wants blood. There are 200 warriors in our war camp east of the Coldrun River, and without a treaty they will raid at the autumn thinning when the harvest grain is in the storehouses. Harwick knows this. His solution will be to send his border guard to burn the war camp first." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "People will die. A great many people, on both sides." She turned to face him fully. "I do not want a war. I came here to make a real peace, not a paper one, not a marriage to a man who despises my people. But the only thing that stops my father's war band from riding is a treaty that means something. And you think I can help with that?" "I think," she said, and her voice had a precision to it that reminded him of the way she had handled his arrow, "that you are the only person in this town who held out his cup last night and did not look afraid of what I would do. I need someone who is not afraid of me, who has standing with the craft guilds, and who can help me move between the Lord's Hall and the lower market without being either ignored or attacked." She held his gaze. "I am asking you to help me build a real peace before the first snow falls." and I am asking you to do it as my declared companion, because without that, neither side will give me a room to negotiate in." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. The cat Bolt chose this precise instant to emerge from beneath the workbench and wind around Dura's boots. She looked down at the cat, then back up at Daniel, and there was something almost helpless in that brief moment. This warrior who could shatter ceremony cups against stone floors, brought up short by a gray cat rubbing its face on her ankle. "Declared companion," he said. "It does not need to be real. It only needs to be believed long enough to stop a war." "Right." He straightened up and looked at his workbench, at the arrow she had set back so carefully in its place. "I will help you stop a war." The pretense began the next day. Ironwall's Market Square was the beating heart of the lower town, a wide cobblestone expanse ringed with permanent stalls and seasonal overflow traders, with the castle gate visible at the northern end, and the river gate at the south. Every morning it was loud and warm with the smell of bread and horse and river mud, and Daniel was a known figure in it, the Fletcher whose arrows won the autumn long-range competitions year after year, whose shop never had a shortage of customers when the border was hot. He introduced Dura to the market the way he introduced anything he believed in directly, without apology, standing next to it. She was aware of the stairs. She had always been aware of the stairs. She had been attending human markets since her father first brought her to trade at 13, and she had learned to move through human spaces with the particular economy of someone who knows they are being watched and refuses to shrink for it. But at Daniel's side it was different. He greeted the baker by name, accepted a heel of bread, tore it in half, and offered her the larger piece without thinking about it. He stopped at the ironmonger's stall and introduced her to a man named Havel with the simple words, "This is Dura Wildheart. She has better taste in arrowheads than most captains I have dealt with, and she is here to make sure we all get through the autumn without anyone burning anything down. Be decent to her." Havel the ironmonger looked at her, then at Daniel, then said, "Does she want to see the new grade of broadleaf heads I forged last week?" She did. The morning moved like that, one stall to the next, Daniel threading the complicated social fabric of the lower market with her at his shoulder, and she watched how he worked quietly, unhurried, with a kind of patient competence that she found she could not stop observing. He was not large. He was of middle height and lean with the particular musculature of someone who draws a heavy bow regularly, and he had a craftsman's hands, careful and scarred and constantly moving. His face was unremarkable in individual parts, a straight nose, gray eyes, a jaw with a few days of dark stubble, but it assembled into something she found she did not want to look away from, which she noted as a professional complication and nothing more. By midday, the whole market knew they were together. By evening, word had reached the castle. Harwick summoned Daniel alone, which was a tactical mistake, because Daniel arrived and said, within the first 2 minutes of the audience, "You called her people animals while the betrothal wine was being poured. I was there." And then he laid out, with the same calm economy he used when describing arrow specifications, exactly what Dura had told him about the warband across the cauldron and exactly what he believed needed to happen. Harwick was not pleased. Harwick was, in fact, furious, and he said several things that Daniel absorbed without visible reaction, and then he said the one thing that mattered. "What do you propose, then, Fletcher?" Daniel proposed a trade fair. Neutral ground on the western bank of the cauldron, with both human market masters and Grimtusk trading representatives. 3 days of commerce before the first frost, with the castle guard standing down and the warband keeping their weapons on their own side of the river. A real exchange, not a ceremonial sham. And the terms of the existing trade route through the Blackrock Pass to be renegotiated with Dura Wildheart present as her clan's representative, since she was clearly the one with the authority and the intelligence to hold it together. She broke the betrothal cup, Harwick said. She broke a ceremony that was built on bad faith. That is different. She is an orc. She is the only reason, Daniel said, that you still have a harvest to protect. Harwick stared at him. Daniel looked back with the patience of a man who had spent years waiting for arrows to dry. "Fine," said Harwick. 3 days, but you will be responsible for her behavior in my walls, Garrison. She causes trouble, it is your neck." "Understood," said Daniel. He was calm about it. He was almost always calm about things, which people sometimes mistook for fearlessness, and was actually just a very deep investment in finishing what he had started. He told her that evening in his workshop, and she stood with her back to one of the shelving racks, arms folded, listening to the terms with her chin slightly lifted. "He agreed," she said when he finished. "He agreed." A pause. "You told him it was his idea, did you not?" Daniel picked up the arrow she had set back yesterday and turned it between his fingers. "I may have framed it in a way that let him think it came from his better judgment." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same emotional territory. "You are good at this." "I make straight arrows," he said. "I know how to account for the wind." She looked down at the cat, who had once again appeared at her feet. She had been coming to his workshop every evening for 4 days now, and Bolt had decided, with the absolute conviction of a creature with no social agenda whatsoever, that she was the best person in the building. "Tell me," she said, not looking up from the cat, "how you knew to hold out your cup." The question was quiet, and it had a different texture to it than her professional questions. More exposed somehow. He thought about it honestly. "I heard what Harwick said. I knew you heard it too. And when you shattered the cup, it was not an act of anger. It was an act of dignity." He set the arrow down. "I have been in rooms where I was the one that no one expected anything useful from. I know what it looks like when someone is surrounded by people who have already decided what they are." He met her eyes. "I held the cup out because you deserve someone to hold one out." She was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the workshop settled into its evening sounds, the creak of the building, the distant noise of the market closing down, Bolt purring. "You are nothing like what I expected," she said finally. "What did you expect?" "Less," she said simply. And then she picked up Bolt, who submitted to this with royal indifference, and she left for the evening. Daniel stood in his workshop and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with the trade fair or the war band or the peace he had just helped broker. And he told himself very firmly that the arrangement was pretend. And then he went back to work. The trade fair negotiations took most of the following week, conducted in a rented room above the River Gate Tavern with Dura on one side of the table and Harwick's trade secretary on the other, and Daniel in the middle being the arrow, the thing that made the distance manageable. He was not a diplomat by training, but he was, as Dura had identified, extraordinarily good at accounting for wind. He knew which concessions cost Harwick nothing but looked like generosity. He knew which Grimtusk trading rights were genuinely essential and which were bargaining positions. He watched Dura across the table and learned the precise micro-expressions that told him when she was actually drawing a hard line versus when she was willing to move, and he learned to read them quickly enough to intervene before the other side pushed too hard. In the evenings they walked the market together, maintaining the appearance of the declared companionship, and the appearance was becoming difficult to separate from something else. She was funny. That was what surprised him most. Not in a gentle or careful way, in a sharp, dry way that caught him off guard and made him laugh out loud when he had not expected to. The kind of laugh that came from somewhere unguarded. She had opinions about everything from the quality of the castle wine to the structural inefficiency of the market's fish stall arrangement, and she shared them with a directness that was either refreshing or alarming depending on the listener. She was alarming to most of Ironwall. She was refreshing to Daniel, who had lived quietly and alone for 3 years and had forgotten what it felt like to have someone with opinions filling up the air around him. On the 6th evening of negotiations, they were walking the market at dusk when she stopped at the archery range that the guard posted for practice along the eastern wall. 3 soldiers were at the line, loosing at distant targets. She watched them for a moment with professional eyes. "The one on the left is torquing his grip," she said. "I know. I have been trying to correct it for 2 months. He refuses to believe a Fletcher knows more about shooting than a soldier. Let me try. He looked at her sidelong. He is going to be difficult about being corrected by an orc woman. I was going to say by someone who is not his superior officer. She gave him a look that communicated clearly that she knew precisely what he had been going to say, and that she appreciated the diplomatic revision. She walked to the range, spoke to the soldier briefly in the flat practical terms of someone who does not require permission to observe the obvious, and then picked up a spare bow from the rack at the end of the range, checked the draw weight with 2 fingers on the string, and with no warm-up and no ceremony, sent 3 arrows into the center of the farthest target so cleanly that the sound of each hit was a single clean crack. The soldier stared. Your arrow kept drifting left, she told him, because you are pressing your thumb against the side of the grip. Release it. Let the bow fall naturally. She handed the bow back, turned around, and walked back to Daniel. The market crowd that had gathered to watch at a cautious distance began slowly to disperse, murmuring. That was not subtle, Daniel said. I am not subtle. She fell in beside him, but I am effective. I have noticed. He glanced at her. Where did you learn to shoot? My mother, she said, and the word had a warmth in it that was different from her usual precision. She said that an orc who can only fight at arm's reach is half a warrior. She was the best archer in the Grimtusk warband until I surpassed her at 19, and she was the first one to say so. She sounds extraordinary. She was, past tense, a small, deliberate weight in it. He did not push, but he walked a little closer to her for the rest of the evening, close enough that their arms brushed in the narrow market lanes, and she did not move away. The trade fair was set for the second week of autumn, on the western bank of the Cauldron, where a natural flat of gravel and river grass made space for stalls and wagons. Both sides had agreed. Grimtusk's warband would hold east of the old rope bridge, and Harwick's guard would hold inside the wall. The market folk would do what market folk always do, which was go wherever there was money to be made. 3 days before the fair was supposed to begin, Daniel got word that a Grimtusk scout, one of the younger warband members, barely 20, had been caught by Harwick's river patrol on the wrong side of the Cauldron and was being held in the castle cells. Not charged, not questioned, just held. As a precaution. The word reached Dura while she was in his workshop reviewing the trade route terms. The change that moved through her face was not anger, not exactly. It was older than anger, the expression of someone for whom this is not a surprise but still a wound. If Harwick holds him, she said very quietly, my father will see it as a provocation. How fast? He may already know. The scouts report every 2 days. Daniel set down his tools. Then we have 2 days. He went to the castle and asked for an audience with Harwick and was told the Lord was unavailable. He asked for Harwick's trade secretary and was told the secretary was occupied. He stood at the castle gate for 40 minutes visibly in the market traffic until one of the senior castle guards, a man named Wicks who had been buying Daniel's arrows for 5 years, came out and said quietly, Garrison, what is this about? Daniel explained. Wicks listened. Wicks went back inside and came out 20 minutes later and said, also quietly, he will be at the eastern gate at sunset. The scout, young, frightened, furious in the way of the frightened young, was at the eastern gate at sunset. Dura was there to meet him. She spoke to him in her own language, low and fast, for several minutes while Daniel stood at the gate with Wicks and watched the last light leave the sky over the Cauldron Valley. The scout left. He crossed the bridge and disappeared into the eastern dark. Dura came back to stand with Daniel. She did not say anything for a long moment. Thank you, she said finally. Wicks deserves the credit. Wicks was not at the gate for 40 minutes being visible. He looked at her. She was watching the bridge where the scout had gone, and the last light was on her face, and she was beautiful in a way that he had been carefully not thinking about for 10 days and was now not successfully not thinking about at all. Dura, he said. She turned. He should have said something practical. He should have said something about the trade fair timeline. What he said was, I want you to know that none of this is pretend for me. The companion arrangement, none of it. She was very still. "I know this was a plan," he said. "I know you needed someone to help move between the two sides. I agreed to it and I would agree to it again. But I want you to know the truth of it because I have been making straight arrows my whole life and I do not know how to make crooked ones for myself." She looked at him with those green-gold eyes in the last light, and her expression was doing something complicated and real, and she said, "I know. You know. I have known for some days." She did not look away. "The difficulty is that I also know my clan is going to ask questions about a declared companion who is a human fletcher from a border town, and those questions are going to be unkind. And, she said, I find that I do not care what questions they ask." She reached out and her hand, warm and strong and very certain, found his jaw and turned his face the last degree toward hers, and she kissed him slow and deliberate and thoroughly, the way she did everything, like she had made up her mind and was not interested in half measures. He kissed her back with his hands coming up to find her waist, and the evening dark settled around them at the gate with the sound of the cauldron running somewhere below an iron wall at their backs, and the kiss lasted a long, unhurried time. When it ended she was still close, her forehead an inch from his, and she said, very quietly, "The pretense, then, is over." "It was over for me on day 2, he admitted. "When you put the arrow back where you found it." She laughed, a real one, short and surprised, and it was the best sound he had heard in 3 years. The trade fair began on a cool, bright autumn morning with the cauldron running high from the night's rain and the rope bridge between the two banks swaying in a light wind off the eastern hills. Both sides arrived with cautious and practiced good behavior, the way people do when they are aware of being watched and judged and do not want to be the one who starts the fire. Grimtusk's trading delegation came with furs, carved bone tools, iron ore from the eastern mines, and cured meats from the autumn hunt. Harwick's merchants brought grain, finished cloth, ceramic goods, and salt from the southern coast. Daniel had set up his own modest stall because it seemed right to be there, and he spent the first morning demonstrating his arrow making and talking to both sides with the same equable patience. And by noon 3 of Grimtusk's warriors were inspecting his fletching technique with genuine professional curiosity. Dura moved between the stalls and the delegations with the authority of someone who had always belonged exactly where she was standing, and Daniel watched her work and felt a pride in her that was uncomplicated and warm. The second day was when the trouble started. It was not from the delegations. It was not from Harwick's guard or Grimtusk's warband. It was from a group of river traders who had come down from the Blackrock Pass to sell raw timber, men who had no official part in the fair, and who had been drinking since midday at the trestle wine stall set up at the market's edge, and who began, in the middle of the afternoon, to say things loudly, confidently, and with the comfortable certainty of people who had always said such things without consequence. About the Grimtusk traders, and about the orc woman running the negotiation, and about what kind of man would attach himself to one of them. Daniel heard it from 3 stalls away. He was at his own stall. He could have stayed there. He was not large or intimidating, and there were 4 river traders and they were loud. He walked to them anyway because the alternative was to pretend he had not heard, and he was incapable of that. "Move on," he said. He said it the way he said most things, without elevation, without performance, just flat and direct. "Fletcher," one of them said. "Do you not know who this woman?" "I know exactly who she is," Daniel said. "She is the reason you are going to have a trade route through Blackrock Pass that does not get raided this winter. She is also the reason I am going to ask you one more time before I stop being polite." "One man," another one said, looking him over, "telling 4 of us." "He did not say he was alone," said Dura, arriving at his left shoulder with the particular silence of someone who had been a warrior since adolescence and knew how to cross ground without being heard. The 4 river traders looked at her. She was half a head taller than the tallest of them, and she was standing with her arms at her sides and her chin level, which was somehow more frightening than any aggressive posture. She met each of their gazes in turn, unhurried, the way someone looks who has time and is not worried about the outcome. They moved on. The market exhaled around them. Daniel turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. There was a moment that passed between them that was not words, a checking, an acknowledgement, a kind of shared warmth. "One man," she repeated. "I had backup," he said. "You did not know you had backup. I had enough confidence to assume you were paying attention." She looked at him with an expression that was warm and amused and something deeper and older than both. "Yes," she said. "You did." She took his hand. Right there in the middle of the trade fair, in front of the delegations and the market stalls and the cauldron and everything else. She took his hand and held it, and he held back, and they walked back to the center of the fair together. The third day of the fair was supposed to be the signing of the new trade terms. Both delegations, all the market masters, Harwick's secretary, and Chieftain Grimtusk himself had all come across the bridge in the morning, with the mood of something almost hopeful settling over the proceedings. Almost. The cauldron had been rising since dawn. Daniel noticed it first because his stall was closest to the bank. The water had gone from the pale gray-green of a running autumn river to a deeper, more opaque shade, and the voice of it had changed lower, more continuous, less the articulated sound of water over stones and more the dull presence of something very large moving very fast. He walked to the bank's edge and looked upstream. The hills to the east were being eaten by a black wall of cloud that was moving faster than he had seen weather move in years. "Dura," he called. She was 20 feet behind him at the negotiating table. She looked up. He pointed upstream. She was at his side in 10 seconds, and she stood at the edge with him and looked, and she said something in her own language that was clearly not polite. "The Grimtusk war band," he said. "How many of them crossed the bridge this morning?" "The chieftain, the delegation 12, the rest held east." "Can they get back across in?" He looked at the cloud wall again. It had visibly moved while they had been standing here. 20 minutes. She turned back to the fair and raised her voice in a flat, carrying command in the Grimtusk tongue, and then she turned and said to Daniel, "Get the market people back. Now, that cloud is a flash storm off the eastern peaks. When it hits, the cauldron will come up 6 feet in under an hour." They moved. The next 10 minutes were organized chaos stalls being collapsed, goods dragged back from the bank, the Grimtusk delegation moving toward the bridge in a fast, disciplined file. Daniel helped 3 of the human traders break down their tent structure and push their wagon back from the bank, and then he turned and looked at the bridge. The first of Grimtusk's party was already across. The chieftain was in the middle of the bridge with 2 of his guard. The last 3 members of the delegation, one of them, a trading woman loaded with a pack of treaty documents, were at the near end, just stepping onto the rope boards. The cloud hit. The rain was not rain so much as a wall of moving water, and it came with a wind that turned the world sideways. Daniel was soaked to the bone in 4 seconds. He heard the cauldron change its voice entirely, the way a dog that has been growling suddenly begins to bark, and looked at the river to see the water rising as he watched, a dark swell coming down from the east that made the rope bridge buck and shudder. The 3 on the bridge were nearly to the far bank. Nearly. The rising water caught the bridge from below, and the rope on the eastern anchor post gave with a sound like a broken bowstring at full draw, and the bridge dropped 6 feet to the left and the nearest of the 3. The woman with the treaty documents grabbed the remaining rope with one hand and hung over the black water. Daniel was at the bank before he had made a decision to move. He was not a large man, but he had the wrists and grip of someone who had been drawing 60-pound bows for 14 years, and he went down the bank to the stub end of the bridge where the anchor stones were, grabbed the nearest rope with both hands, and held. His feet found purchase on the slick rocks at the edge, and he braced and hauled, and the bridge rose 3 feet with the weight of him on the other end. "Move," he shouted at the 3 on the bridge. "Move now." Dura reached him from behind, closed both her hands over his on the rope, and the combined weight and strength of them levered the bridge section up and held it, and the 3 figures on it scrambled the last 10 feet to the eastern bank as the cauldron rose beneath them, and the anchor post gave entirely, and the bridge went. The rope ripped through their hands. Daniel's feet went from under him on the wet rock and he went backward. Dura caught him. She had him around the chest from behind, both arms locked across him, her weight dropping back from the bank's edge to keep them both from going into the river, and they went down together on the muddy bank, tangled, soaked, with the roar of the flooded cauldron 3 feet from their heads and the last of the bridge timbers vanishing into the gray torrent. They lay there for a moment in the rain that was still coming down in absolute sheets, Dura on her back with Daniel on top of her, her arms still around his chest, both of them breathing hard. He was aware of her heart hammering under him, her warmth through the wet leather her face when he turned his head close, right there, rain running down her jaw, green-gold eyes wide and bright. "You could have gone in," she said. Her voice was not steady. "You caught me," he said. "You should not have gone to the bank at all." "She had the treaty documents," he said. "We needed them." "Daniel," she said his name with an edge of something that was not anger, something rower. "Do not do that." "Do what?" "Risk yourself for a document." She released a slow breath, the arm across his chest tightening fractionally before she made herself loosen it. "Risk yourself for anything without telling me." He turned fully to look at her. They were still down on the bank, rain coming down, the river screaming beside them, and she was looking at him with an expression that he understood at the deepest level of him was not about the treaty documents and had not been for some time. "I am telling you now," he said. She pulled him down and kissed him in the rain with the flooded cauldron trying to swallow the world beside them, and it was nothing like the careful, deliberate first kiss at the gate. This was urgent, shaking slightly, the kind of kiss that comes from the place where the adrenaline runs out, and what is left is the naked truth of what someone means to you. He kissed her back with everything he had, his hands in her soaked hair, and the rain came down and the river roared and neither of them moved for a long time. The delegations had all made it across. The documents survived in their oilskin wrapping. The bridge did not survive, but a bridge could be rebuilt, and when the storm passed 3 hours later, the terms of the trade agreement had been signed on the eastern bank with Chieftain Grimtusk's seal and Harwick's secretary's countersignature, and the thing was done. Daniel and Dura were dried out by a fire in the riverfront tavern, sitting close together with cups of hot spiced cider, with the market's aftermath moving around them and neither of them saying very much. He had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side, which was not a posture she usually permitted herself. She had a warrior's careful instinct about how much she revealed in public, but she was tired and wrung out, and his warmth was a specific and particular thing that she had decided to stop pretending she did not want. "My father is going to want to meet you," she said, finally. "The chieftain." Daniel considered this. "He will not be gentle about it." "I imagine not." "He will have questions. About your family, your blood, your standing." "I am a fletcher from a border town," Daniel said. "I have a cat named Bolt and 2 broken lathes, and I make the truest arrows on this stretch of the border. That is my full inventory." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He is going to ask what you can offer a Grimtusk woman." "What does a Grimtusk woman need?" He asked it genuinely, not as deflection. Dura looked at the fire for a long time. "Someone who holds his ground," she said. "Who is straight. Who is not afraid of what she is, but also not afraid to tell her when she is wrong." A pause. "Someone who will hold out a cup when everyone else in the room has decided to look at the floor." He turned to look at her profile in the firelight. "Tell him that. Tell him exactly that." She turned her head. She was close, their faces a breath apart. "You would really go before Chieftain Grimtusk?" "I will go before anyone," he said. "For you." The fire crackled. Outside, the cauldron was settling from its rage. The storm had broken and the night air coming through the tavern door was clear and cold and smell of wet stone. "Daniel," she said, and his name in her mouth had that particular weight to it again that he was learning meant she was about to say something important. "I am not practicing at this. The declared companion arrangement was a strategy. What I feel now is not a strategy." "I know," he said. "Neither is what I feel." "I have been careful my whole life," she said. "I have been careful about what I want, because what I want has usually been unavailable or unsafe or both. I was careful in that great hall. I broke the cup instead of breaking the man who deserved it because I am careful. And then you held out your cup, and I was no longer careful." He did not say anything because there was nothing to add to that. He took her hand instead, the one resting on her knee, and she turned it over and laced her fingers through his with a quiet deliberateness, and they sat like that while the fire burned down. The meeting with Chieftain Grimtusk took place 2 days later, when the cauldron had dropped enough to ford at the shallow crossing a quarter-mile south of the collapsed bridge, and Daniel walked across on horseback with Dura beside him and approached the war camp east of the river. The camp was organized in the Grimtusk way, high tents in concentric rings around the central fire, the chieftain's longhouse den at the center, the whole thing radiating a sense of structured and deliberate power. Daniel had been to orc trading camps before, smaller ones, but he had not been to a warband's main encampment, and he was aware of eyes tracking him from the moment his horse's hooves touched the eastern bank. Grimtusk met him in front of the chieftain's tent, which meant this was to be a public evaluation. No privacy, no casual conversation, everything said in front of witnesses. He was enormous, gray-green and scarred, with small dark eyes that were entirely too sharp, and he looked at Daniel the way that Daniel had been looked at his entire life, as someone who seemed at first glance insufficient. "Garrison," Grimtusk said. It was not a greeting, it was a catalog number. "Chieftain," Daniel said. He stayed on horseback until Grimtusk looked as though he might speak again, and then he dismounted, which was the right move. It brought him lower, but it was voluntary, which was different from being forced down. Grimtusk said something in the Grimtusk tongue without taking his eyes off Daniel. "He is asking you," Dura said quietly at his side, "what you bring to a Grimtusk woman." Daniel looked at the chieftain. He thought about what Dura had said at the fire, about what a Grimtusk woman needed, and he gave Grimtusk the same thing he had given the market, the castle, and the trade negotiations, the plain truth, delivered without decoration. "I cannot out-hunt her," he said. "I cannot out-fight her. I am not a chieftain's heir or a lord's son, and I do not have land or a great name. I make arrows. I make the truest arrows on this border, and when I point them towards something, they hit." He held the chieftain's gaze. "I pointed myself at stopping this war before it started, and I hit. I pointed myself at getting your delegation across a collapsing bridge, and I hit. I pointed myself at your daughter, and I hit, and I intend to keep hitting until she tells me to stop." A pause. "She has not told me to stop." Grimtusk looked at Dura. Dura said something short and definitive in her own tongue. From the way several of the surrounding warriors quietly adjusted their postures, Daniel surmised it was something like, "He is correct." The chieftain was silent for a long, waited moment. Then he said in passable human trade tongue, "Arrows do not last, bows break." "Fletchers keep making them," Daniel said. Grimtusk made a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. He turned and went back into his tent without ceremony, which Dura told Daniel with visible relief meant they could go. "He did not say no," she said as they rode back to the ford. "He did not say yes. With my father, absence of no is almost the same thing." She was watching the path. "You said you pointed yourself at me and hit." "I did say that. In front of 30 warband warriors. I did it in front of Harwick's whole castle first," he pointed out. "I'm not consistent about where I say things like that." She laughed, the real one, short and surprised, and pushed her horse slightly closer to his, and their knees bumped together on the trail, and she left hers there. The trade route through Blackrock Pass opened 3 weeks later, when the first of the autumn merchant caravans came through from the east with Grimtusk trading escorts and Harwick's guards standing down at the wall. It was not a grand ceremony. It was merchants doing business and warriors doing their jobs, and the ordinary machinery of commerce beginning to turn where there had only been the threat of fire. Daniel watched the first caravan come through the market gate from his workshop door, a line of loaded wagons with both human drivers and Grimtusk escorts, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. Not triumph, exactly. More like completion. Like an arrow that had found its target cleanly and landed with the particular certainty that is different from luck. Dura appeared at his workshop door that evening. She had been going back and forth between the camp and the town all week, finessing the last logistics, and she looked tired in a way she did not usually allow herself to look, the kind of tired that comes from caring very much about something, and finally being able to stop fighting for it. She came inside. She sat on his workbench stool, which she had commandeered several weeks ago, and which Bolt immediately vacated to make room for her, and she leaned her elbows on her knees and looked at him. "It is done," she said. "It is done." He poured 2 cups from the small clay pitcher he kept on the shelf, the same rough red wine from the trade fair, and held one out to her. Looked at the cup, then at him. Then she took it, and something passed through her expression that was warm and full and almost unbearable in its completeness. "You are always holding cups out," she said. "Only for the right people." She drank. He drank. The workshop was quiet around them, the good familiar smell of sawdust and fletching and lantern oil, the cat purring somewhere on the floor, the sounds of Ironwall's evening market closing down. "I am supposed to go back to the camp in 2 days," she said. He set his cup down. "I know. My father will have questions about timing, about whether I am staying with the clan for the winter or, he said. She looked at him. "Or," he said, "you stay." The word sat between them in the quiet. He watched her face move through something private and complicated and finally settle into something clear. "My whole life," she said, "I have been somewhere between 2 worlds, too fierce for the treaty tables, too careful for the war band, too orc for the human markets, too comfortable in human markets for the pure-blood faction of the clan." She turned the cup in her hands. "I have never been fully in one place." "This place could be yours," he said. "If you wanted it. I am not asking you to give up your clan or your blood or your world. I am asking you, and I know what I am asking, I am not naive about what it costs, if you want to make a life here with me, in the space between the worlds you have been standing in your whole life." She was quiet for a moment. "You are the only person," she said, "who has ever made the space between feel like a place worth being." He crossed the workshop and crouched in front of her stool so he was looking up at her, which was the honest posture for what he wanted to say. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been careful about saying it because I know what it means to you, and I did not want to say it casually, but we are past casual. You have been in my workshop every evening for 3 weeks, and I have been at your side for everything that has happened since you broke that cup, and I am not pretending any of it." He held her gaze. "I am in love with you." Dura Wildheart, who had stood before Lord Harwick's entire castle and shattered a betrothal cup without blinking, who had held a collapsing bridge rope with one arm and caught a man with the other, who had walked into a chieftain's war camp audience with the composure of someone who feared nothing. Dura Wildheart put down her cup very carefully and cupped his face in both her hands. "I know," she said. "I have known. I have been in love with you since the bridge." Her thumbs moved against his jaw. "Probably before the bridge, probably since you put the arrow back where you found it." He laughed. "It came from deep, from somewhere genuinely happy." "You remember that," he said. "I remember everything you do," she said. "Every careful, straight, honest thing." She leaned her forehead down to his. "I'm in love with you, Daniel Garrison, entirely." He kissed her, and she slid off the stool to meet him, and the workshop got very quiet for a long while. The weeks that followed were the best of his life. He was honest enough with himself to know it, and he turned the knowledge over now and then like a stone with unexpected weight, the pure, simple fact of it. He had been lonely for 3 years. He had been good at his work and absent from everything else, and the loneliness had been so habitual that he had stopped feeling its edges. Dura's presence had revealed the shape of it by filling it, and the filling was warm and specific and real in a way that he had not known to hope for. She was not an easy person in the comfortable, accommodating sense. She had opinions about how he stored his arrow shafts that she shared at full volume. She took up half the workshop when she sat in it, not because of her size but because of her presence, which was large and direct, and in no way interested in being small. She knew things he did not. She knew the eastern hills, the mountain passes, the clan trade routes, the medicinal plants of the Orc tradition, 3 languages and several fighting disciplines. And she shared this knowledge with the same frank efficiency she brought to everything, expecting him to absorb it and find it useful, which he did. And she learned from him. She watched him work with the same intent, absorbed attention she had shown on that first morning in his workshop, and she asked questions that were always more precise than he expected, and she got very good over the weeks at the fletching, not the lathe work or the cutting, but the binding and setting of the feathers, which she did with her large, careful hands and perfect eye for angle. He told her once that she had a gift for it, and she said, without false modesty, "Of course. I told you I know arrows," and he laughed. They went out of the town together, scouting the Blackrock Pass route in the first fresh snowfall to assess the road condition for the winter caravans, which meant a day and a night traveling east before returning. They slept in the lean-to shelter at the halfway point, fire burning, their bedrolls pressed together in the practical way of people who travel cold country, and the warmth of her against him in the dark was everything. On the road back, she was riding slightly ahead of him through the last stretch of forest before the town walls, and the morning was cold and brilliantly clear, and she looked back at him with the light on her face and her braid coming loose over one shoulder, and he thought very simply and without drama, "There is no version of my life I want that does not have her in it." They came in through the market gate with their horses blowing steam in the cold morning, and Wicks, the gate guard, looked at them with the small smile of someone who had been watching a thing develop for weeks and found the development satisfying. In the deep of the first cold month, when the market had moved indoors and the trade route ran on its established schedule without needing emergency management, Dura went east to the war camp for 10 days to winter consult with the clan, as she had done every year. She went alone, because that was right. She had clan duties and Daniel had his workshop, and she came back on the 10th evening with an expression that was thoughtful in a way he recognized as preceding something important. She sat at his workbench and accepted her cup of wine and was quiet for a few minutes. "My father had a long conversation with me," she said. Daniel waited. "About what I want my life to look like." She turned her cup. "About whether this," she gestured between them and at the workshop and vaguely at Ironwall beyond the walls, "is a choice I have made fully." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that I had made it with more certainty than any choice of my life." A pause. "He asked if you had made it with the same certainty." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he should ask you himself." She met his eyes. "So he is coming tomorrow morning." Daniel took a sip of his wine. "Right," he said. "He will not be polite. He was not polite last time either. Last time you had a treaty to leverage. This time it is just you." "Just me," he agreed, and he was not afraid. He had stopped being afraid of Grimtusk somewhere around the bridge, somewhere around the moment when the only thing that mattered was holding the rope and not what anyone thought of the person holding it. He looked at Dura. "What does it mean in your clan's terms if I say yes to whatever your father is going to ask me tomorrow?" She was very still. "In the clan's terms," she said carefully, "it means a formal declaration, a life claim. It is not a human-style marriage ceremony with rings and priests. It is," she paused, "the claiming rite. The woman kneels and names the man as her chosen before witnesses, and the man accepts. It is old. It is irrevocable in the clan's eyes." "She kneels," he said. "In our tradition, the one who kneels is the one who claims, not the one who submits. The act of kneeling is strength. It is the warrior saying, 'I have chosen this person over every other thing I could have. I do not kneel to them, I kneel to the choice itself.'" He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that what you want?" "I have wanted it," she said, "since the bridge, probably before." Her voice was steady, but her hands were not quite. "The question is whether you want to be claimed by an Orc chieftain's daughter in a public rite in front of the Grimtusk warband, and whatever witnesses my father decides to summon." "Ask me," he said. "Daniel." Ask me the question you are actually asking." She put her cup down. She looked at him directly with all of herself, nothing held back, all the careful management of her expression laid aside. "Do you want me?" she asked. "Not as a strategy and not as a pretend arrangement and not as a thing that happened around a treaty. Do you want me as your life?" He crossed the workshop in 3 steps and kissed her answer into her before he said it out loud, long and thorough and definitive, and then he held her face in his hands and said, "Yes, completely. There is nothing in me that is not sure." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were bright. "Good," she said, with a small, unsteady exhale that was her version of overwhelmed. And then, because she was Dura, she added, "Because my father will be at the gate at sunrise and he will not be patient." He laughed. He laughed freely and completely, the way he had been laughing since she came into his life. And she smiled at him, that full, real, unguarded smile that was only for him. And he pulled her close and held her in the firelight of his small workshop above the market. And the evening was warm and specific and real. Grimtusk arrived at sunrise with 10 warband witnesses, a traditional number for a formal declaration, which meant Dura had told him what to bring, which meant she had been more certain of Daniel's answer than her careful question had let on, which he found endearing and told her so, and she told him to be quiet and straighten his coat. The market square was not empty. It was morning, and Ironwall's market came alive at dawn, and the arrival of Chieftain Grimtusk with 10 armored Grimtusk warriors at the gate was not an inconspicuous event. Wicks had clearly passed word along the guard, because there was a loose ring of watchers forming even before the delegation had crossed the square market people, guild masters, a handful of Harwick's lower court men, merchants and craftsmen and ordinary citizens of the border town who had all, by now, heard the story of the betrothal cup and the fletcher who had held his out. Harwick himself was not there, which was either tact or cowardice, and Daniel did not spend energy deciding which. Grimtusk stopped in the center of the square. He was in his formal wear, not ceremonial, exactly, because everything the Grimtusk chieftain wore had the potential to be a weapon, but the good version of it, with his rank markings and his clan bond beads, and the wolf-jaw clasp on his cape that matched Dura's iron bead cord. He looked at Daniel the way he had looked at him across the river camp, as an inventory. But this time, the inventory had a different quality to it, not assessing whether Daniel was sufficient. Assessing whether he knew what he was getting into. "Garrison," he said. "Chieftain," Daniel said. "My daughter has chosen you," Grimtusk said. "It was not a question." "Yes. You understand what that means, for her standing. For yours, for the space between your worlds." "I understand that neither of us lives entirely in one world," Daniel said, "and that together we cover more of the ground between them than either of us does alone. I understand that she is the most capable, most honest, most remarkable person I have met in my life, and that being chosen by her is an honor I intend to spend the rest of my life being worthy of." He met the chieftain's eyes. "I understand that you will have concerns about this, and that your concerns are legitimate, and that I will not be able to resolve all of them with words, only with time. And I intend to give you as much time as it takes." Grimtusk looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The market had gone still around the square, the ring of watchers holding its collective breath. Then Grimtusk turned to Dura and said something in the Grimtusk tongue, and she answered him, and he nodded once, a single, definitive movement. And then Dura Wildheart turned to face Daniel in the center of the market square of Ironwall, with the castle gate behind her and the morning light on her face and 10 warband witnesses and a ring of watching townspeople, and she went to her knee. Not a slow or reluctant movement. A clean, deliberate warrior's movement, one knee down on the cobblestones, her back straight, her chin level, her green-gold eyes on his face with all of herself in them and nothing withheld. The square was absolutely silent. "I am Dura Wildheart," she said, and her voice was strong and clear and entirely unhurried, the way everything she did was when she had decided. daughter of Grimtusk, daughter of Mara Swiftarrow. I am a warrior, a negotiator, and a woman who has stood between two worlds her whole life and found the space cold. She held his gaze. I name you, Daniel Garrison, as my chosen, in the oldest rite of my blood. I claim you as my life, not because I am required to, not because a treaty demands it, not because the world approves of it, because you held out a cup when everyone else looked at the floor, because you held a rope on a flooding bank, because you have been straight and true and aimed directly at me from the first moment, and I have never been aimed at like that before. A pause, and her voice was very steady and very full. I kneel to this choice, not to anyone's permission, not to anything but the truth of what you are to me. The market held its breath. Daniel looked at her, this fierce, extraordinary woman on her knee before him, in front of her father and her clan and the town that had doubted her. And he was aware of his own heart beating with a clarity and fullness that he had not felt since before Aldous died and the loneliness had set in, and possibly not before that either. He was aware of the watchers, the witnesses, the weight of the moment, and he was also aware that none of it mattered as much as the single specific truth of her looking up at him. He held out his hand. She took it, and he brought her to her feet, and he did not kiss her yet. That would come after, because first he had something to say. I am Daniel Garrison, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the silent square. I make arrows. I am not a lord or a captain or a man of great standing, and I do not have clan blood or an ancient name. What I have is everything you have already seen, and I am not hiding any of it. He held her hand in both of his. I accept your claim. I claim you back, in whatever right you will accept from a Fletcher, fully, permanently, without reservation. He looked at her. I was aimed at you from the first night, too. I just did not know it until the morning you came to my door and put my arrow back where you found it. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite tears, but lived somewhere between a sound he had never heard from her, and he discovered he wanted to hear it again every day for the rest of his life. Grimtusk said something from behind her that was short and rough-voiced, and which Daniel did not understand linguistically, but understood completely in tone. The sound of a man who is not ready to be moved, but is, in fact, moved. Dura turned to her father. They spoke briefly, quietly, their voices low in the Grimtusk tongue. The chieftain's hand came down once on his daughter's shoulder, heavy, brief, unambiguous. He looked at Daniel once more, and gave the same single nod he had given before. Then Dura turned back to Daniel, and he kissed her there in the market square, in front of the war band and the witnesses and the whole watching town, properly and thoroughly, with his hands on her face and her hands fisted in his coat, and the silence broke into noise around them, the complicated noise of a town that had opinions, some of them surprised and some of them approving and some of them still uncertain, but the voice of it warm in the way of people who are watching a real thing and know it. She pulled back and looked at him, her face flushed and her braid loosened and the iron bead cord catching the morning light, and she said very quietly for only him, "Now it is real." "It has been real," he said, "since the first cup." She looked at the ghost of a smile on his face and matched it with her own. "I should have known," she said, "when I poured for you. I should have known then." "I should have known when you put the arrow back," he said. "We were both slow. I am not slow. You took 11 days to kiss me. You held your cup out and then stood there like a man who had no idea what he had just done. I had no idea what I had just done." "Fortunately," she said, and she was still close, their foreheads together, her voice warm with something that was going to be the rest of their life. "I did." The morning unwound from there into the ordinary and extraordinary business of people who have just changed everything. Grimtusk accepted the cup of trade fair wine that Daniel produced from the workshop, both of them standing in the market square with no ceremony, and he drank it and said something brief that Dura translated as, "He says you have a narrow grip but you hold well," which was apparently a compliment. Daniel accepted it. The warband witnesses stayed for an hour, moving through the market with the curiosity of people experiencing a new place, buying bread and looking at the ironmonger's stock and being, in the careful but genuine way of people trying, decent. Havel the ironmonger showed 3 of them his broadleaf arrowheads, and ended up in an animated technical conversation that required no shared language and cross-species entirely on the basis of metallurgical interest. And Daniel stood at his workshop door and watched, and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing that was true working the way true things work. Dura stood beside him in the market door, and her shoulder was against his. After a while she said, "You will need to come to the war camp for the winter rest, my father's terms. When, after the last autumn caravan comes through, I will need to close the workshop. Make sure Wicks knows to send any commission requests to my assistant, who is," he stopped. "I do not have an assistant. You have been doing the work of 3 people alone," she said, in the dry tone she used when she found him simultaneously admirable and exasperating, which was often. "We will find you an apprentice before the caravan season is done, someone whose hands are good. You want to help me find an apprentice. I want to help you build something you do not have to sustain entirely alone." She said it simply, without weight. "That is what I am here for." He looked at her. She was looking at the market, watching the warband witnesses and the iron wall merchants moving around each other with cautious and growing ease, her chin level and her profile clean in the morning light. "You know," he said, "when you walked into my workshop the first time, I thought, this is a woman who has never needed anything from anyone." "I have needed things," she said. "I was careful not to want them." "What changed?" She turned to look at him. The green-gold eyes were warm and direct and entirely present. "You," she said, "quite specifically." He took her hand, standing in the doorway of his workshop with the market square alive around them, and the cauldron running a mile to the east and the Blackrock Pass open for the season, and the first real peace in 3 years settled over the border like clear weather. He held her hand, and she held his, and the cat appeared between their feet and wound around both their ankles at once, indifferent and proprietary and perfectly certain of its territory. "That cat," she said, "he likes you. He tolerates me." From Bolt, that is deep devotion. He looked down at the gray cat navigating their feet with judicial calm. He ignored Aldous, who was a genuinely excellent person. She squeezed his hand. "Tell me about Aldous," she said. He looked at her, this woman who had stopped a war and saved his life on a collapsing bridge and knelt in a market square and chosen him in front of everyone. And she was asking him about his dead master because she wanted to know him, all of him, the whole map of the person she had claimed. And the loneliness that had lived in his chest for 3 years was simply, quietly gone. "He was a Fletcher," Daniel said, "the best I have ever known. He taught me everything about grain and grain against grain, about how the wood remembers the tree it came from, about how a good arrow is honest, it goes where it is pointed and it does not pretend otherwise." He paused. "He would have liked you." "Why?" "Because you go where you are pointed," he said, "and you do not pretend otherwise." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I like him already." They stood in the doorway while the market moved around them and the morning got bright and cold and full, and the border held its peace, and the cauldron ran clear and manageable between its banks, and the Blackrock Pass was open for business, and none of it was magic or luck. It was work and honesty and a cup held out at the right moment by the right man to the right woman who had poured it back with both hands and stayed. He turned to her. She was already looking at him. "Come inside," he said. "I want to show you the new shaft design I have been working on. It is a longer knock than standard, for the new longbows Harwick's guard is switching to, and I cannot decide on the spine weight." "You absolutely could decide on the spine weight," she said, following him in. "You know what the answer is. You want a second opinion. I want your opinion." She stopped inside the door and looked at him with an expression that was entirely warm. "All right," she said. "Show me." He showed her, and she told him he was overthinking the spine weight, and that he should trust his original calculation, and she was right, and he told her she was right, and she told him she knew, and he laughed, and Bolt settled on the workbench between them, and the workshop filled with the sound of 2 people who had been aimed at each other from the beginning finally occupying the same space without pretense or strategy or anything, except the simple and enormous fact of wanting to be exactly where they were. Outside the market ran, the caravan route was open, the border was quiet. And in a narrow workshop between a cooper's yard and a tanner's stall, smelling of sawdust and lantern oil and the particular good smell of honest work, the fletcher and the chieftain's daughter sorted feathers for arrows together in the late autumn light, and it was the truest thing either of them had ever made.